Most important to remember tonight is Shirley, and who Shirley was, and how Shirley has impacted her family, how Shirley has impacted New Yorkers, how Shirley has impacted workers, and how Shirley has impacted storytellers as well. This program is part of a 3-day-long conference sponsored by the National Endowment for the Humanities. I have many organizations that I love, but this one I love profoundly because its mission is to bring the humanities and to bring scholarship to a public. And so the NEH, since 1965, has been sponsoring museums and exhibitions and art extravaganzas and scholars to do work specifically, though, thinking not just about that work, but how that work impacts and reaches a public. So how did we get to Red Shirley? Well, we got to Red Shirley because we knew we wanted a digital storytelling keynote speaker who could take us out of the museum world and just think about digital storytelling. I'm like, who could that be? Who could do this? And Jason Eisner, who's an artist and a staff member at the museum, said, what about Laurie Anderson? And we said, oh my goodness, that's great, but how do we get to Laurie Anderson? Like, she's not my neighbor, I don't have her on my phone, how do we reach out to her? Well, as it turns out, there's a wonderful establishment, a dining establishment and a food establishment in the neighborhood you might have heard of 4 generations. It's called Russ and Daughters. Anyone? Yeah. And I believe that's one of the, not the patriarch, because the patriarch started it in the 19-teens, but 3rd generation owner Mark Russ Fetterman is here. Do you mind standing too so we can all... So you're saying, what does Locks have to do with Laurie Anderson? Well, she likes it, and specifically she likes herring. And when we reached out to Pomegranate, which was, we knew we had one of the educators, Eva Amese, who worked at Pomegranate, so we reached out to Eva to say, could you reach out to Laurie for us? And at the same time, I emailed Jeremiah Zimmerman, over a manager at Russ and Daughters, and I said, hey, just so you know, in case you see her, maybe say put in a good word for the Tenement Museum. But then he did a lovely email introduction, and Laurie was at the Tenement Museum the next day. So again, it's just really So how do we get to Shirley from there? When we were discussing when the keynote would be, I said, it's going to be May 1st, and she said, let's do it May Day. And then I said, yeah, and what about Red Shirley? And she said, what about Red Shirley? What could we do with Red Shirley? I'm like, I don't know, but we'll figure it out. But we came up with this idea together of having a public program where we would screen Red Shirley. And the program, as it evolved, became even more than the screening, because as I talked to more and more people, I heard more and more stories about Shirley. And I became even more intrigued with this woman who, in many ways, was just an ordinary person. Someone who wouldn't necessarily make it into the history books, someone who we haven't all heard about. That's kind of what the Tenement Museum specializes in. We elevate the stories of ordinary people in order to inspire connections past and present. So this intrigued me more. And when I first saw the film, I saw the film because someone also outside of the museum world, Mike Smerdick, over there, sent me the film. And it was the middle of my day, I stopped my day, I watched this film, and my heart stopped, because there was something about this film that was so, like, the heart of everything. There was something about humanity. We're talking about National Endowment for the Humanities. Here, this 99-year-old woman had all of the humanity that I've ever seen, and I wanted to learn more. And so it's so exciting to be here now, having gathered so many people who've been able to illuminate different aspects of her life with us to talk about her. So I think we will launch into the film, but before we do launch into the film, I want to call up Jill Opal, who was a cousin of Shirley and also the niece of Lou Reed, who prompted this film in the first place. So Jill is a lawyer in New York City, and she's been so kind to come to us. She is also the mother of Shayna, and the daughter of Merrill, whom you will meet very soon.
Thank you for that, Annie. So, you mentioned that Shirley was an ordinary woman, and in a lot of ways she was, but in most ways she wasn't. Shirley was actually one of the most extraordinary people I've ever met. I feel like most of us have had the situations where we're obliged to visit our older relatives. It's the right thing to do. We go because we're supposed to. No one had to go to visit Shirley. Everyone wanted to visit Shirley. Shirley just had the most personality, the best stories. She just seemed to never, her brain never got old. Even when her body was failing her, she was with it 100%. There was one time that my husband and I took our kids to go see Shirley, and she looked at me and said in her accent, which I will not try to recreate, but you'll hopefully hear shortly, whatever happened to that apartment? And I looked at him and I said, uh-oh. She couldn't hear well, so you could talk in front of her without her really knowing. So I said, uh-oh, Scott, she's starting to lose it. I said, this is it. And I got really nervous. I said, Shirley, what apartment are you talking about? She said, the apartment right above you. You were talking about buying the apartment above you and building a spiral staircase. And I started laughing hysterically. And I looked at him and I said, she's not losing it. I totally forgot. It had happened, a conversation a couple of months before. We had looked at an apartment, it didn't work out. I had completely forgotten the incident. Shirley remembered every detail, including the spiral staircase. I mean, that's who she was. Every time you went to that apartment, she knew, first of all, you were never alone. Somehow you would knock on that door and someone else would be visiting Cousin Shirley. Every single time. It was pretty amazing. So that was a really good feeling. And so when Lou decided to make a movie about her, which I just think is the greatest thing. My husband's a social studies teacher, and he actually is for 6th, 7th, and 8th grade students, special ed students, and he uses this movie every year in his classroom and shows it to his students every year because it shows so much of the history that he's trying to get across. So it's been really great to be able to incorporate our lives into his classroom as well. But when Lou decided to make the movie, he said to me, would you write some questions for me? So, you know, I did what I guess most nieces do, sure, whatever you're doing. Not paying attention. And then he asked again. Well, finally I said, Lou, what do you want? Like, why do you want me to write? You're the lawyer, write the questions. I tried to explain that I don't know what being a lawyer and writing the questions has to do with anything, but I'm very glad I did it. I sat down and wrote a couple of questions out for him. You could actually see the lovely font of my law firm paper in the movie at some points that he's holding. But I hope the movie works so you can see it. If not, it's readily available online. But it was really wonderful to be a part of it, and more importantly, I'm just so glad to have been able to spend as much time as I got to spend with Shirley, because she was just one of the most incredible people that you could ever meet.
Maria Jackson, and she sang spirituals, and it was sending kind. It was so moving. The whole thing, you have no idea. It's like living through a lifetime, you know?
She's a British-American director based in New York. She directs classical work and new plays in the US and the UK. She is currently the associate director for Fiddler on the Roof on Broadway and The King and I at Lincoln Center Theater. And I am told that the Fiddler is actually here with us this evening. Is that true? Thank you, Fiddler. Yes. Is the King? No. The King is not here. But Tyne is here, and Tyne is the granddaughter of Rosa. Tyne is the granddaughter of Shirley's sister, Rosa, and she's going to be reading some reflections from her father, Rafi, who's in England right now, who is Rosa's son, and she's also going to share her own reflections as well. So please join me in welcoming Tyne.
My father, Rafi Raffaelli, was Shirley's nephew, and he was born in Palestine and grew up in Israel and now lives in London. I was born in London, I now live in New York, and Shulamit Rabinowitz was born in a shtetl in Zara's restaurant called Berestovich. When Shirley passed away down the road in Chelsea, when she was 102, my father was the executor of her will. and he wrote a very beautiful narrative of Shirley's life from beginning to end, which I think you all have. And as he distributed her very few belongings, he included this narrative so that everybody could have a better sense of who she was and the scope of her life. So I'm just going to read a little bit, mainly from before she came to America. She was a rebellious child in a war-torn land. The First World War brought the Germans in after defeating the Russians on her doorstep. She was 6 years old. She remembered an unexploded shell landing through the roof of their house onto their kitchen table. The Germans were welcomed by the Jews of the town. They brought progress, running water, paved roads, and a library. Shulamit, Shirley, loved reading. Social justice was her creed. Her favorite authors were Sinclair Lewis and Jack London. Like her younger sisters, she swallowed all the printer's words she could lay her hands on. Her schooling was interrupted by the defeat of Germany in the First World War and the establishment of the Polish state in 1919, which, in turn, was invaded by Soviet Russia. This war again was fought on her doorstep, and again her formal schooling was interrupted. She recollected years later a Jewish Bolshevik officer pointing a gun at her father's head, demanding to know where he had hid the provisions from their shop. Her father didn't tell. By the time the Russians were defeated in the re-establishment of Polish rule in her part of the world in 1920, Shulamit's worldview was taking shape. The book that changed her life, she said, was Romain Rolland's Jean-Christophe, at the time a popular multi-part novel with very strong socialist messages. She was 15, and in a radical left-wing Zionist home, where Hebrew was spoken and written, she became a very vocal communist sympathizer. A dangerous thing to be in newly Polandized and renamed town of Berestowice. Too young to be a party member with patchy formal schooling, the only school she continually attended was Hebrew school. Her father, after being warned by a friendly policeman that she was in danger of arrest, decided to send her to nearby Białystok to live with relatives and be trained as a dressmaker. She didn't like to talk about her time there, but by the age of 18, she was married, and her new husband was heavily involved in what she called her politics. It became even more dangerous for the young couple. It was decided that they must leave Poland. The obvious place for them to go was the US. Each of their parents had relatives who emigrated to the States at the turn of the century, but by 1928 the US had closed its doors to Eastern European Jews. So her father arranged a passage for her to Montreal, Canada. There, she was met by a man who put her one suitcase, and her mandolin on a train, and she crossed the US border. She was, and remained for most of her life, an illegal immigrant in the US. And this is the way my father finishes. Shirley never lost her faith. She had to accept the slow decline of the movement and the eventual collapse of the Soviet Empire. She said that the Russians had betrayed the dream, and was reading with great interest and revelations, the revelations that came out after the fall of the Berlin Wall. She was convinced that the dream would resurrect itself and rise again from the ashes, propelled by the human desire for freedom and for justice. When this Messiah comes, my father used to say to her, and she smiled and nodded. The last time my father saw Shirley was a few weeks before she died. She spent her days sitting quietly on her sofa. She would sit there all day long, not talking, said Rosa, her beloved Dominican carer, who she taught to prepare the best chicken soup in New York. When my father asked Shirley what she was thinking about, she said, my childhood. She died alone in her apartment on May 16, 2011. She was 102. Sorry, thank you. Thank you.
in very brief description, our panelists. We have Merrill Weiner, who is a psychotherapist in private practice. She was the director of the Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder Program within the Division of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry at North Shore University Hospital, Manhasset, New York. She is Shirley's cousin, Jill's mother, and Shayna's grandmother. So please, if you want to take a seat. And we have Ralph Gibson, a fine arts photographer whose work is in over 150 museums, dozens of books that he's written. He's the winner of National Endowment for the Arts and Guggenheim Awards, among many others. He co-directed Red Shirley with Louise. Laurie Anderson is an award-winning performance artist. Her latest film, The Heart of a Dog, won acclaim after playing at the Venice and Toronto Film Festivals, and you can catch it, I think, this week and next on HBO. Please join us. And last but certainly not least, Tony Michels, who's a professor at the Professor of History at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He's written wonderful books, including My Heart. Oh my God, I'm blanking.
A Fire in Their Hearts.
A Fire in Their Hearts. Thank you. It's one of my favorite books ever. A Fire in Their Hearts. Seriously, Yiddish socialist in New York. And Jewish Radicals, a compilation of radical writings. Tony also met Shirley in the 1990s when he was working on his dissertation. So we'll talk about that as well. And he's here to help provide some historical context. I'm going to sit down in a moment, and my goal tonight is just to ask a few questions to launch us into a conversation about Shirley. So I'm just going to...
She was his spiritual grandmother. And when we were kids, Shirley really, she did not come out to the house that often that I recall. Don't forget my parents were about as middle class as you could humanly get. And she was so much about not succumbing to bourgeoisie, So when she came out, she never brought any male with her that I met. But I saw what happened, which is that they were kindred spirits, that it was a perfect match of her and Lou, of a woman who totally accepted what he represented, who he was, no matter what excesses he might at one time or another display. And he regarded her, I think, as really that person in your life who always makes you feel like a shiny penny, who always makes you feel really special. And you saw it in the movie when she could say things to him that if a journalist ever said it to her, he would have killed him dead, right, like on the spot. So I think it was a beautiful relationship that was meant to be how they came together. The stories about her, that time, right? She was a life force. She did not suffer fools gladly. She really didn't. So I had asked her about her marriages, and she had 3, which was unusual at that time. And I said, Shirley, you were so ahead of your time. And she said, they called me Bunny. Bunny, they were all behind me. She had a zest for living. And my mother and Lou's mother unfortunately passed away with dementia after 5 years of just terrible tragedy. But seeing Shirley, who Jill told you, she didn't forget anything. She had a reader. Lou paid for the reader. What did the reader tell me at Shirley's memorial? That she learned so much because Shirley insisted that the reader spend 4 hours reading every page of the international section of the New York Times. That's at 99. I don't know about you, but it's better than me. She had a zest, and that zest came across as well when they screened Red Shirley. You remember this? You screened Red Shirley, and you were up on the panel, right? And, here's Ralph and my brother and these people, and what did Shirley do? She grabbed the mic and she started lecturing all of us on workers' rights. It was snowing, she couldn't see well, she couldn't hear well, but none of that zest was gone. She was just a remarkable human being. My final story is that she couldn't see well, she couldn't walk well. She had fallen, and she was in the hospital. The doctors were poking and probing her. She was probably 100 at that point. I said, "Shirley, how are you?" She could have complained, and she said, "Ugh, Bunny, they'll have to take a gun to kill me." Those are my memories of Shirley.
There's a really touching moment where she says, what she was thinking when she first got here, when she said, "I'll never know English, I'll never learn a trade." That's what she was thinking at night when she went home and she cried. And I think that experience that she had allowed her to empathize with waves of immigrants and workers that came after her as well. And this was really notable. There's a wonderful book that was kind of in the film shot for a second called The Invisible Thread that Shirley was profiled in. You can kind of see that in the book, and we looked that up. And she says she's been in America at this point for a year and 2 months, or a year, 2 months and a half. Take Social Security, for example. I went to the first demonstration in support of Social Security and unemployment benefits on March 6, 1930 in Union Square. I'll never forget the date and the year because back then, Social Security and unemployment benefits were considered unattainable, the dream of crazy people. But I fought for it. If it weren't for the Social Security system today, millions of Americans would now be starving. So she might be called Red Shirley, but she fought for something that we take for granted as mainstream, so much. And she was fighting for this 14 months, 15 months after coming to this country without even fully knowing English, which is remarkable. I want to shift gears for a second and ask Ralph, who was there filming, what it was like to film, kind of what you went into this hoping to do. Did you both have a plan? Was it iterative? What do you think? Why do you think Lou wanted to do it, and why do you think Shirley wanted to do it?
Well, the backstory is that I had met Lou a couple of years before. We'd meet for lunch. She said, "Call me for lunch anytime because I'm self-employed. I can join you." So we had our lunches at Ambrose, and one day he sprung this idea on me about doing a movie. And I had worked in my 20s as a documentary cameraman, and it was just back-breaking work, and I wasn't interested. So, he was very cool about it. And he brought it up a couple more times, and he says, I've got this new camera. Come over and see it afterwards. And I went over there with this little Canon 5D, which is, the workhorse. And I immediately recognized that there would be something possible that wouldn't be so arduous physically. So he told me a little bit about Shirley, but you have to understand that when I walked into that apartment in Chelsea the first time, I'm meeting this woman, first time in my life, and but I quickly realized that she was the matriarch that perhaps we all long for. And I've always had older people in my life, and now of course there's far fewer. And so it was when I'm looking at this footage myself, when I'm analyzing how I feel about what I'm seeing, is that for me, it's essentially a portrait of a man falling in love with an old lady, and that's how I relate to it. By the end of the first, we only shot this in 2 days because of Shirley's age and energy. But after 2 or 3 hours, we were kind of taking a break and looking at some of the footage and making a little eye contact with one another. We knew something was happening. We knew, you can see Lou's incredible love for her. And, sitting here tonight, I was looking at that early television footage of her where she's talking. Shirley's much more vivid, much more present towards the end. It was as though her life accumulated into this glowing example of humanity. And her polishes are great, and her life was great, and anybody here would love to live to be 102 and have as much life as she had in her. It was a great privilege, and I miss Lou for a lot of reasons, but I'll always be very grateful for him inviting me to collaborate with him on this exquisite project.
There's one more specific and one more abstract. But why do you think Lou decided to make this film when he did? What were the kind of the immediate catalysts, or what was going on at the time that made him decide that? He had a long relationship with Shirley, so that's one thing. And then also just to kind of reflect on as much as it's a film about specific stories of Shirley and Lou, how does the film speak to like broader, more universal patterns of family and memory?
Ooh, that's a really big one. The second one. I'll start with the first one.
You can skip the second.
Okay. Shirley was really losing her eyesight, and Lou was really concerned with that, so he was always trying to help her. Like, he was getting all kinds of devices so that she could read better, and so that she would look at something that was magnified like 500 times, and he was designing glasses as well. He had something called Lou's Views, and he also had an app that was about being able to make type a lot bigger, so people who were losing their eyesight could read their phones. And so he was. I think that as she lost her sight, that they began talking more. I think, and he began asking her more questions, and that was really the only way she could communicate at that point, because reading was such a big thing for her. These two were like a comedy team, so they really tamped it down in the film, but they were just hilarious. They were always doing this to each other, and she was, so how are you feeling, Shirley? I'm terrible. Louis, kill me now. It's just like, back and forth. They were such good friends, and they had so much fun together. So that kind of, this is a little bit more formal, the film. They're kind of like doing that. But hearing her voice, and also one thing, the first thing I heard about her, the first thing that Lou said was, here she is living alone in Chelsea, and to the end of her life, she's 10% of her pension goes to the NAACP. This is an incredible woman, and I'm so happy to have a kind of role model heroine, because at this moment in the United States, I just feel, I don't know about you, but I feel a lot of misogyny. I really do, and it's not making me feel very happy. So I'm looking always to find women who are just really badass women. That's Shirley. She's really said her talk, spoke her mind, and she represented these people who, they're speaking Italian, they can't really, to them, the boss is the patron, he's the boss, and they can't really say much about him. She could, so she spoke for them. And I think anyway, I'm really hoping that her story will become a bigger thing, because also the last thing I want to say is that I've really been interested in how different people have seen Shirley, and it's your dad Rafi said, this is Lou Shirley that we're just looking at. There are many, many Shirleys. There's so many Shirleys, and I think part of the things that the multiple stories that are happening here, and the attempt to tell multiple stories at the Tenement Museum is because you really try to say who someone was. It's half you, and to really tell the story of someone is really difficult. So the first time I went over to see the Tenement Museum, the restoration of the building, which if you haven't seen it, it's so fantastic to walk into a building that looks like 100 years ago. And the greatest thing was there's some text that you can access in different ways. It's very beautifully done. And then, and you see this text written on this kind of magic desk. But what's even more magic is you pick up a phone and you hear the voice of this person. Because it's one thing to say, I used to have a shop on Orchard Street and I used to sell pickles. And it's another to pick up a phone and go, used to have a shop and I sold pickles on Orchard Street. It's just fantastic because you're immediately drawn back in through your ears to someone telling their story. Because that's the best way that can happen with that voice of the person. So anyway, I love this museum for that reason, because it's really gritty. It's not like some twinkling, multimedia, whatever, but it really is, let's go and stand in a room that hasn't been that it's the same as 100 years ago, and it's breathtaking. It's so beautiful. So thanks for making this incredible place.
Well, I'm only continuing a vision that began long before me and with many people working on it, but we appreciate the kind of the way in which the grittiness is also a part of the story, right? That this isn't a historic house museum that talks about a president or an engineer. It really is about ordinary people with their accents, with their struggles, and that we kind of think a lot about not really knowing what the full story is. And one of the ways, though, that we try to piece together stories is bringing in historians of all different backgrounds to kind of look at our stories and help us piece together the context. Often, people tell stories of their family without knowing exactly the broader trends. And Shirley is someone who lived 100 years, whose family spanned her, her between her parents and her sisters, 3 continents. She lived through World War I. She lived through the Bolshevik Revolution. She lived through the Great Depression. She lived through World War II. She lived through the birth of the State of Israel. She lived through all of these things. She lived through the 90s. So all of these historical moments, in and of themselves, each one could take on scores of historians to help us make sense of it as well. Luckily, we have here with us Tony Michels, whose book, A Fire in Their Hearts, is one of my favorite books ever, and I'm on page 174 in a footnote too, so I really do know the book. But the book is wonderful, and I wanted to ask you about Shirley. First of all, I want you to tell us how you came to know Shirley, because you knew Shirley before you knew who Lou Reed was, but you didn't know the connection to Shirley, so if you want to share that.
This is the mid-1990s, I was doing research on my dissertation, which is on the socialism in Yiddish culture in New York, and I interviewed a very old Yiddish literary critic named Itchik Goldberg, and I was interviewing him in his office on Broadway, and he said, and I told him who I was interested in talking to and who I was doing research on, and one of them was a man by the name of Paul Novick, who was Shirley's 3rd husband. And he said, well, you should talk to Shirley Novick, and wrote down the address. I wrote to her. I was staying in Hoboken, not Hoboken, Jersey City at the time. She wrote back to me very quickly and said, come over and we'll talk. I went over there and we talked for a while. And she said, come back next week. I'll make dinner and I'll show you some papers. And so she made schnitzel and cabbage soup. And this is in this apartment. The apartment she was in is the workers' housing. It's in Chelsea. It's the houses that were built by the International Ladies Garment Workers Union. She was a member of that union. So she lived in the housing built by the union she was a member of, one of the union's great accomplishments. And so we sat in the living room, and there was a fantastic sunset over the Hudson. It looked right on the Hudson. And that's one of the things I remember besides her soup and schnitzel. And we talked for a long time, and she told me a little bit about her childhood. Some of the details were not mentioned in the film. And then afterwards, there were 2 things. She was very generous. She allowed me to photocopy a newsletter in Yiddish. This was the newsletter of the Socialist Party branch of Lower Manhattan. And her 3rd husband was the editor of that. I'm sure it doesn't exist anywhere else in the United States. I've never seen it anywhere. It was socialist. He was in this is 1917, and he was in the Socialist Party.
Dan Katz, the labor historian there.
And so we went to the local photocopy machine, copied it, and the Indian or Pakistani man behind the counter said goodbye to her in Yiddish when we were leaving. He said, "Zaygesehen, Shirley," and that was really nice. We went back up to her room, up to her apartment, and I was sorting through her papers. She was giving all her papers to the Yiddish Institute for Jewish Research, and she needed some help going through them. And there was an issue of Rolling Stone magazine from the early, mid-70s. And I said, "Shirley, how can you have a copy of Rolling Stone magazine here?" And she said, "Because my cousin's in it." I said, "Who's your cousin?" And she said, a little perturbed, "Lou Reed." I said, "Oh." I said, "You know who he is?" And he said, "Yeah, it's my cousin." And I said, "Yeah, he was in Fantastic American Lavelle." I know, I've seen him.
He went to the concert.
Yes, she said, "I've seen him play multiple times." And I wanted to switch the line of conversation, but I didn't want to insult her, because the evening I was there to speak with her and about her life and pace off Paul Novick. So I don't know if it was the right thing. I somewhat regret it because I had a lot of questions. But anyway, I left it at that. And went through the papers, and the final thing I saw that was actually really interesting was a speech that Laurie gave to this CMJ Music Convention in the late 80s on anti-Semitism. This is an unpublished speech, and he was very upset by recent incidents in anti-Semitism, particularly in the rap world. A band called Public Enemy had gotten into some controversy. And he was very upset by it. He gave a speech, and he mentioned Shirley in the course of the speech and said, my cousin was very close with, was a lifelong member of the NAACP, and married to the editor of The Forward. I'll explain why that was a funny gaffe. And she fought for social justice, and this is an insult to people like her. What Laurie didn't know is that she hated the editor of The Forward, because The Forward was a Socialist Party newspaper, and her husband was the editor of the Freiheit, which was the Communist Party newspaper. So that was for a historian, that was a kind of a funny thing. Yeah, she would have had a small heart attack. Yeah, this is the kind of thing that makes professors laugh.
Let's go back though to her, because I think that gives a sense both of not every Jewish grandmother is alike, or not every old Jewish lady is alike, and then there were a lot of, and not every old Jewish person of that generation was alike, because there were many different political ideologies that were espoused by the people that built the tenements in this neighborhood, or in Harlem, or in Brownsville, or in East New York, and they moved to other neighborhoods as well. But I want to go back to kind of the roots of that in Shirley's own life. In the film, she says both, I didn't want to go to America, and I didn't want to go to Palestine. Tell us a little bit about who she was and how she differed from her own family in that generation, and how that carried through.
So one thing she mentioned to me is that she grew up in a Zionist family, as you heard, but she mentioned that she was sent to what was called a Tarbut school. This was a school, brand new school system at the time, created by lovers of Hebrew. And instead of, so for parents who were Zionist and forward-thinking and modern, rather than send their children to religious schools or purely secular schools, a state school or whatever, they sent them to these Hebrew schools where instead of learning religion or only about religion, they learned all sorts of subjects in modern Hebrew. So she learned very, very good Hebrew through the Tarbut system. That was one thing that was, fairly unusual at the time, although becoming more common in that era. It seems that she went in the direction of left-wing Zionism. What I gleaned, and she didn't tell me this, I'm just gleaning it from the details of what she told me, and what I know is she seems to have gravitated to a Marxist Zionist party that was both pro-Soviet and pro-Zionist at the same time. It's a tough trick to pull off, to be both. But this was the group I think she moved towards. And then, sooner or later, most of those people made a choice, which was either go all the way and become a communist, or not. And in her case, she became a communist in the it looks like sometime in the 20s. The party was illegal in Poland, and that's what you heard about in the record, and why she was in danger of really getting into serious trouble. So she had moved from left side, from a progressive Hebraist home to radical Marxist Zionism, and then all the way to communism by the time she got to the United States.
I mean, so there really is a way in which through this family you could trace the kind of the different ideas coursing through modern Jewish history, as well as the intersection of Jews and American history and American culture. I'm wondering if you want to say anything else to that point. In some ways, maybe I'll ask this again. To what extent was Shirley typical of her generation? To what extent was she atypical or unique?
Right. I wouldn't say she's typical, but she was reflective of a generation. The generation of Jews who came here in the years after the Russian Revolution and World War I that had several characteristics. One is that they had lived through a horrific experience of war and pogroms and depending on where you came from in Europe, expulsions by the Tsarist government or slaughter in Ukraine by government anti-revolutionary forces. It was a really traumatized generation that lived through these experiences for about 6 years, 1914 to 1920. And many of the young people were highly radicalized by that experience, in part because the counter-revolutionaries were so anti-Semitic, and on the other hand, the saviors of the Jews were the Red Army. It was the Soviet Union that rescued the lives of many, many Jews. And so for a young radical going through this, you became even more radicalized by it. Didn't mean you became a communist, but you had a real revolutionary fervor whipped up during this experience. And there was a feeling that the Soviet Union had solved, or had the potential to solve, the major crises of Europe at the time, generally capitalism, and war, and so forth, and for the Jews specifically, anti-Semitism. The Soviet Union was able to solve the Jewish problem that no other country, it seemed, had been able to do. And so why waste your time on going to Palestine from this perspective if the Soviet Union was doing it now, in the here and now? The reality was much more complicated, and I'm trying to explain to you how a generation came to view the revolution and invested in such hope. And she was so reflective of many, many young people who came to the United States in the 1920s, who lived through that. And they had a passion for both radical politics. The other passion was culture, and that came out a little bit. And many of them were really committed to high Yiddish culture, literature and theater on a high level in the United States, and that was true as well. You might have spotted some Yiddish books on her shelf. It was an early shot in the film. Her shelf was lined with Yiddish books, and that was also reflective of that conversation, that generation. She's not unique. There were many others like her, and she said that. There were many activists. But the characteristic of that generation was the high level of radicalism combined with the passion for Yiddish culture. Or maybe she was slightly different. She was a lifelong activist from a very young age, and for a long time. It didn't come fully across in this film, but she was a communist. And so she comes across as a spunky worker, which she was, but she was also part of an organized movement that framed her entire life. And the backbone of that movement was really the generation that came after World War I, which she's a part of.
So quick memory and a question, because I met Shirley because I was giving a talk at EVO, the Center for Jewish Research, when I was doing my research on Yiddish socialism and the ILGW. And Tony's book later was very important to my book. There's about 75 people came, and she sat front and center. And at the end of the talk, she stood up and said, "You got it wrong." And when I asked her who she was, and like Tony, I didn't know anything about Lou Reed. She said, well, I was married to Paul Novich. And I got very excited because he was the longtime editor of the Morning Freiheit, the communist paper. And she invited me to her house, and I went, so I was one of those people. My memory, I wish I'd reread my interview. I haven't read in many years, but my sense of it is the reason why she was in the Italian shop is because she was blacklisted from the Jewish shops. And probably a secondary thing was that she was also trying to organize for the communists in that shop. I mean, she was organizing everywhere. So I guess my question is about, maybe Tony and others can talk about more about her activism. When she represented to me in that talk and at her apartment about really a partnership with her husband in terms of the Morning Freiheit and what that newspaper meant and her activism with the communism and her organizing the shops. Do you have any more information or thoughts about that?
About, you mean the kind of relationship she had with Novick?
Yeah. What her participation in that?
We didn't talk at all about that. I went there to speak with her about her husband, but I very quickly, she just didn't know enough about the period I was interested in, which was 1910s and 20s. So we spoke about her and her life really the whole time.
Tony was too busy getting the schnitzel to ask. But I know that in the piece by Rafi Raphaeli, he notes that towards the end of his life, when the readership was dying out of the Freiheit, that she and Pesach Novick traveled the country, trying to raise awareness for it and fundraise, and she hosted salons in her living room as a part of this. So I think that she was probably my guess is a very important part socially in keeping the community around that would be gathering to help support and sustain the newspaper. I don't know if anyone has any.
Okay, hi. I was Shirley's neighbor, and I just want to add one story to the communist thing, and she just was so ballsy. And somewhere in the 50s, I didn't get a lot of details. I knew her later in her life. But somewhere in the 50s, I don't know what happened with Paul, and they had a falling out with the Communist Party, and they kicked him out of the party. And so Shirley left the party. So the communists came to her and said, Shirley, we don't want you to go, we just want him out. And she said, I'm not staying if you're not letting him back in. So one, you have to apologize publicly, and two, you have to let him back in, and then I'll come. And they did. And that was Shirley. She was so amazing. And she was just amazing. I don't have a question. I could tell you Shirley's stories for an hour. She was amazing.
She was part of the American Communist Party? Okay. So Gus Hall and all that stuff. Okay. I didn't know whether Freiheit was distinct from, let's say, the Daily Worker, or is that?
So the Freiheit was the daily Yiddish newspaper of the Communist Party, founded in 1922, and it was the largest circulating communist newspaper in the country in any language in the 1920s. The Daily Worker came along 2 years later and didn't have the circulation that the Freiheit had, which gives you a sense of the nature of communism in New York in the 1920s. It was heavily Jewish. And so Novick was the second editor of that newspaper after the first editor passed away in 1939.
Just really quickly, is there anyone else in the room who also knew Shirley? Do you have a story you want to share? Yes.
Thank you. I'm Sylvia, formerly Reed. I'm the second Mrs. Reed. And I knew Shirley quite well. It was a very important time in my life with Lou when he started becoming very curious about Shirley and other relations. And I think in a respect, I was thinking about why was this so. Shirley could share stories of his father with him that meant a great deal. And I remember in particular noticing a difference. She remembered Sid as a young man, a young and very idealistic man. And it was quite surprising to Lou and I to learn about this period of life when she shared that during the fighting in Spain, he wanted to go and fight, very idealistically. And this man, if you knew him later, this was not something that you would ever have imagined. So she knew him as a very vibrant young man, and I think this was crucial to Lou to learn more about where he was coming from, where his dad was coming from in relation to the man that he knew later. When I think of Shirley, I think of red lips, the red beads around her neck. We shared a love of that sort of jewelry. I still have a piece of ceramic art. She had gorgeous ceramic pieces. And she was so fast, she was so quick, and it was great fun to sit with Lou and her and watch them both outdo each other. The witty remarks, gentle put-downs, and emphasis on culture, literature. You sort of had to have read a certain number of things for her to have, for her to respect you. And she talked a lot about her marriage with Pesach. And it was interesting because I think the age difference between her and Pesach was similar to the age difference between myself and Liv. So we talked about that. And it was, she meant a great deal to me.
I just have a question. Whatever happened to her sisters, Rachel and Rosa? And did Shirley ever have any children of her own?
I'm going to call up time. Is that okay for you?
Rosa, so two sisters survived. Rosa was my grandmother and Rachel was my great aunt, both of whom moved to Palestine, lived in Israel, and brought up a family there. Shirley didn't have any children of her own, and Shirley outlived everybody. Yeah. And came to Israel very regularly, and came to London very regularly, and was at all of our bar bat mitzvahs, and was a true traveller of the world when she could.
I know that there's a question over here.
I'm wondering what the plans for this footage were initially, whether they evolved over time. I mean, in some ways, this resembles sort of what I think many of us wish we had done, which was sit down someone we knew was aging and who had very interesting stories and could reveal to us a world that was, disappearing. But many of us regrettably never did it. I don't know whether there was initially a plan to make this a public piece or a piece that was accessible to the public, and also whether over time those plans changed, and also whether sickness, age, limited what you were able to collect in the end, or whether you achieved your ambitions with it.
First of all, while we were making it, we knew we had something going. We said, well, Lou had been a judge at the Tribeca Film Festival several years, and I had donated artwork as a prize, large prints. So we thought we would submit the Red Shirley, perhaps in a favorable light, considering our past. And the film was rejected. It was considered a long short. It's 29 minutes, and so that was their pretext. But in direct answer to your question, it did go to 14 festivals. So it, Shirley lived on. I mean, she seems to have achieved some kind of immortality. I guess after 100, this transpired. But one story I wanted to tell, is very essential to the making of the film, was that, I was there as we worked out the music, the sound. It was a great moment when Lou's metal machine music segued so beautifully when we were cutting the film. And the other thing was that in New York, the film premiered at Lincoln Center. And it was a great night, and the theater was full, and Lou's knees were knocking backstage, and we just didn't know what Shirley was going to think. And of course, he had a lifetime of concern. I'd only met her twice, So we show the film, the crowd's going crazy, and we're wheeling her back, and she stops the wheelchair. She looks up at him, and she said, "You left a lot out."